I was 14, and it seemed like an ordinary night around 9 p.m. I was at my cousin's house, babysitting him while my mom and aunt were out shopping, and my dad and uncle were at the movies. We were sitting on the couch watching TV, but something didn't feel right. I had this weird, strange feeling like something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. The feeling wasn't going away. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it got. So, I got up and walked to the back door to lock it, just in case. As I walked back through the kitchen, I saw something that was causing my weird feeling. Outside the window, there was a dirty, ragged, homeless-looking man. He was staring straight into the house, his eyes locked on my little cousin. A chill ran down my body. My protective instincts kicked in immediately. A wave of fear gripped me, but I knew I had to stay calm for my cousin's sake. I didn't want to scare my cousin, so I pretended I hadn't seen anything. I told him we needed to go upstairs because our parents would be home soon, and they wouldn't want him staying up too late. We went upstairs, and I tucked him into bed, even though I knew there was a strange man outside who wanted to get in. Once he was in bed, I stood there for a moment. I knew I had to do something. At the time, I was about 125 pounds and 5'4", and I played football at school. I felt strong, but that didn't make me feel any safer. I went back downstairs, straight to the kitchen, and grabbed a meat tenderizing hammer, anything that could help me defend us. I took a deep breath and turned back at the window where I had seen the man, but he was gone. Panic set in. I rushed to the front door, checking the locks over and over again, making sure everything was secure. Then I went back upstairs with the hammer in hand and sat down in front of my cousin's bedroom door. My cousin asked what I was doing, and I told him not to worry. Everything was fine. Then I called the police with my shaky hands, then my dad and uncle. The police said they'd take about half an hour to arrive, and my dad and uncle were 45 minutes away. Just as I hung up, I heard a window shatter, and the sound of heavy boots walking around on the main floor. My heart raced. I whispered to my cousin to stay as quiet as possible and hide under the blankets. I could hear the guy walking sound slowly climbing the stairs. It was horrifying. I gripped that damn meat hammer and waited. About 5 minutes pass, and then I hear the boots slowly climbing the stairs. It is horrifying. My cousin's room was just 10 feet from the staircase. The man opened the door to my aunt and uncle's room, then the bathroom. After a moment, I heard him walking back downstairs and opening the door to the basement. The next 15 minutes felt like hours, but finally, the police arrived. They searched the house and found out the man had escaped from a nearby mental hospital. The terror of that night never left me. Even now, I can still hear those heavy boots echoing in the darkness. Still haunts me.
In 2010, I was a senior in high school, ready to finish my last year and move on with my life. My school had its fair share of strange stories, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that October. Mrs. Whitaker was one of those teachers everyone loved. She taught English and had a passion for literature that was contagious. But there was something off about her that year. She seemed distant, distracted, like she was carrying a heavy burden. One day, she didn't show up for class. The substitute told us that Mrs. Whitaker was taking some time off for personal reasons. Weeks passed and still no sign of her. The rumors started swirling. Some said she had a breakdown, and others claimed she ran away. But no one knew the truth. Then, on October 21st, something strange happened. I was in the library, working on an essay. The place was nearly empty, except for a few other students. As I was typing away, I heard someone calling my name. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was clear as day.
Come here.
I looked around, but no one was there. I figured I was just hearing things and went back to my work. But then I heard it again, louder this time.
Come here.
The voice was coming from behind a row of bookshelves at the back of the library. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the shelves, my heart pounding in my chest. When I turned the corner, I saw her, Mrs. Whitaker. She was standing there, her back to me, staring at a blank spot on the wall. "Mrs. Whitaker?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't respond, just kept staring at the wall. I took a step closer, and that's when I noticed something was wrong. Her reflection in the glass of a nearby window. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, staring back at me, while the real Mrs. Whitaker remained motionless. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. "Mrs. Whitaker?" I called out again, but she didn't budge. Her reflection continued to stand there, staring directly at me, as if it was alive on its own. I could feel my heart racing, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something was terribly wrong, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was as if my feet were glued to the floor. I forced myself to take a step forward, and as I did, Mrs. Whitaker slowly turned around. Her eyes were vacant, as if she was looking right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were slightly parted, as if she was about to speak. "Mrs. Whitaker, are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She finally spoke, but it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, distorted, like multiple voices speaking at once.
Help me,
She said, her lips barely moving. The room seemed to grow colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. I took another step back, trying to get away, but her reflection was still there, watching me. I turned to run, but as I did, the door to the library slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. Panic set in, and I fumbled for my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight. When I finally managed to get it on, the light was dim, barely cutting through the thick darkness. I shined it towards where Mrs. Whitaker had been standing, but she was gone. The entire room was empty. I raced to the door, yanking it open and running down the hallway as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, the cold autumn air hitting my face. I looked back at the school, expecting to see something or someone following me. But the hallway was empty. The next day I tried to tell my friends what had happened, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. Mrs. Whitaker never returned to school, and the principal claimed she had moved away suddenly, without explanation. But I knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to her, something beyond what any of us could understand. I started researching, trying to find any clue about what I had seen. I dug through old newspapers, online forums, anything that might give me an answer. It turns out, I wasn't the first student to experience something like this. Over the years, there had been stories of other teachers disappearing, strange occurrences in the school that no one could explain. It was as if the school itself was cursed, a place where people vanished without a trace. I eventually graduated and moved on, but the memory of that day has never left me. Sometimes I still dream about Mrs. Whitaker, standing there in the library, her empty eyes staring back at me. And in those dreams, I can still hear her voice, distorted and haunting, whispering,
help me.
But no matter how many times I have that dream, I know there's nothing I can do. Mrs. Whitaker is gone, lost to whatever darkness had consumed her.
I was working the night shift at the hospital, a job I had been doing for years but still couldn't get used to. The rain was relentless that night, hammering against the windows like it wanted to get inside. The sound was noisy, echoing through the empty hallways and making everything feel colder and lonelier. I wrapped my sweater tightly around me. It wasn't just the weather. There was something in the air, something that made me feel like I shouldn't be here. It was 2:30 a.m., and the emergency room was strangely quiet. A few patients were resting in the waiting area, and the occasional cough echoed down the hallway. I was in the nurses' station, trying to keep busy, but the flickering lights were giving me a headache. I looked at the clock, but the time seemed to be moving at a snail's pace. Suddenly, the lights flickered again and went out, but didn't come back on right away. I stared at the dim emergency lights that were switched on, casting weird shadows on the walls. The sound of the rain increased, and for a moment I felt completely alone. I could see the buzzing of the lights struggling to stay on, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something felt wrong in the hospital, like the building itself was alive and watching me. I decided to take a walk around, to keep myself awake and shake off the fear growing inside me. As I walked down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoed back at me, and each step felt heavier than the last. I passed by empty patient rooms, their doors slightly open, with shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a strange flicker of light coming from room 304, a room that should have been empty. I stopped, trying to remember if I had left any lights on in there, but I was sure I hadn't. My heart started beating faster, and I felt a strong urge to go back, but I kept moving forward. I told myself it was just a faulty light, trying to calm my nerves. I slowly pushed the door open, and the sight inside made me freeze. The room was dark except for the faint glow of a small lamp. The bed, which had been empty earlier, now had a patient in it, a woman, her face pale and eyes closed. I blinked, trying to recall if I had missed something, but I was sure no new patients had been admitted. The woman's appearance was strange. She was wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown, the kind we hadn't used in decades, and her long, wet hair was spread across the pillow, like she had just been brought in from the rain. I moved closer, and the air felt colder. The woman wasn't breathing, and her face looked like she was in pain. At first, I wanted to check her pulse, but something held me back. There was a bad smell, like mold and something rotten. I leaned in closer, trying to ignore the scary feeling that was growing inside me. That's when her eyes snapped open. They were wide and vacant, staring right through me, and her lips began to move without making a sound. I stumbled back, nearly stumbling over my own feet, as the light in the room began to flicker. She started to whisper, her voice barely audible over the rain, but I heard a few words. "He's coming. Don't let him in." Before I could react, the lights in the room went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the door. The whispers turned into a low hum, like a chant, and I could feel the vibrations in my bones. I finally managed to grab the door handle and pulled it open, started running back into the hallway. The rain was louder now, almost deafening, and I could hear faint footsteps approaching. But when I looked, no one was there. I ran back to the nurses' station. My colleague, Lisa, was there, looking at me with confusion. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to catch my breath, pointing back down the hallway. "There's a woman in room 304. She's not supposed to be there." Lisa stared back at me and took a flashlight. We both went back to the room. I was trying to figure out what I saw, but when we got there, the room was empty. There was no one in the bed, no lamp, nothing. The bed was neat and tidy, and there were no signs of anyone ever being there. Lisa looked at me concerned. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded and said, "She was there, Lisa. She said something about not letting someone in." Lisa's face went pale. "You've heard the stories, don't you, about the man in the rain?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she was looking nervous. I had heard the staff talking about it, but I never believed it. It was just a scary story, right? They said that during heavy rain, a man in a wet black coat would appear, searching for lost souls to take with him. Patients and staff had reported seeing him over the years, always during the rain, always when the lights flickered. Just then, we heard footsteps coming from the hallway. They were slow and heavy. We turned to look, and that's when we saw him. A tall, dark figure stood at the end of the hall, just out of reach of the dim emergency lights. His face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, and his coat was dripping wet, with water pooling on the floor around him. Lisa grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "Don't look at him," she whispered in her shaky voice. "He's not real, just don't look." But it was too late. He slowly turned his head towards us. Even though I couldn't see his eyes, I knew he was looking straight at me. The hallway seemed to shrink, making him feel closer than he really was. The figure moved closer, and I heard a squelching sound as his wet boots touched the floor. Lisa pulled me back, breaking my focus, and we started running. We didn't stop until we reached the elevator. We kept pressing the button until the doors opened. As we got in, I saw the figure standing in the hallway, water falling from his coat, not moving at all, before the doors closed. The elevator ride felt like forever. When we reached the lobby, the sound of the rain was quieter, but the weird feeling didn't leave. The next morning, as the sun finally rose through the stormy clouds, we checked the records. There was no one admitted to room 304 that night, and the security cameras showed nothing. No woman, no figure in the rain, nothing. Since then, I haven't worked a night shift, and every time it rains, I feel a creepy vibe. I can't imagine what the woman whispered. "He's coming. Don't let him in." And now every time I hear the rain, I wonder if he's out there, waiting for someone else to see him, waiting to be let in. Have you ever felt the presence of something dark? I have. Our apartment never felt like a normal place. It was the only home I had ever known, but something always seemed off, like a shadow lurking just out of my sight. My parents have lived in this apartment since they got married. It was supposed to be a fresh start for them, especially since my dad was struggling to find a job. My grandparents also moved in with them. The apartment wasn't something they stumbled upon by chance. An old lady who lived next door recommended it to them. She quickly became friends with my grandma, bonding over coffee and daily chats. At first, she seemed like a regular, kind-hearted neighbor. My grandma didn't notice anything unusual about her, but as time went on, things started to change. One day, while visiting the old lady's apartment, my grandma noticed something strange, a book of dark magic lying on a table. She didn't say anything at that time, but from that moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Soon after this, strange incidents started to begin in our apartment. One day, my grandma noticed that someone placed a melted green candle inside our front door's lock. It was such a strange and disturbing thing to find. My grandma is a very religious woman, so when things like this started happening, she went to see her priest. In our culture, it's common to have a specific priest as a spiritual guide. Before she could even explain why she was there, the priest looked into her eyes and said, "I know why you're here. You're afraid that someone is doing dark magic on your family." This shocked my grandma. The priest told her that as long as she attended church every Sunday, she would be protected. However, my grandma was the only one in our family who did this. Despite the priest's words, the old lady continued her dark magic. My grandma thought that the old lady was jealous of her and my mom because they were happily married while she lived alone. Then something even more terrible happened. My grandpa, who had always been a healthy and athletic person, suddenly got cancer. He had no history of smoking or any bad habits, but within 6 months, he passed away. It was shocking because he had been perfectly healthy before this. After my grandpa's death, my grandma started to pray a lot, and eventually my mom began to pray too. Then one day, the old lady suddenly decided to move out after a fight with her sister-in-law, who also lived there. My grandma believed that the old lady had used dark magic on her sister-in-law as well. Years later, the old lady eventually passed away. In our culture, it's common to put a person's remains in a smaller box. When this was done with the old lady's remains, someone told my grandma that the old lady's remains hadn't decayed as they should have, which was very disturbing. Even before I knew this story, I always felt a bad energy in our house. I have a friend who is very gifted in reading tarot cards, and every time she read mine, the card with a bat would appear. In tarot, this card is a symbol that someone has cast a spell on you. My grandma is convinced that the old lady's spells are still at work, even after all these years. The nightmares started when I was in elementary school. One night, I dream about demons. I saw the devil as a goat standing on 2 feet, placing something dark and evil under my bed. I told my priest about it, and he said it's common to have such dreams, but I don't think so. My grandma also told me that my dad and brother were never the same after the old lady's dark magic started affecting our lives. She thinks they must have stepped on something of hers, something cursed. It's like a darkness has taken hold of them, something they can't escape from, no matter how hard they try. As I grew older, I asked my grandma if anyone had warned the new woman who bought the old lady's apartment after she moved out. My grandma said that by the time they met the new owner, it was too late. She had already purchased the apartment. The woman had moved in with her soon-to-be husband, but according to my grandma, they broke up shortly after their wedding. She believes the evil energy in the apartment is what breaks them apart. I started believing it too. The atmosphere in our apartment feels like something is always watching and waiting. When I was younger, I had an incident that I still can't fully explain. One night, I was in my room trying to sleep. The door was closed, my grandma was in the kitchen, and my mom and sister were in another room studying. As I was sleeping in my bed, something pulled my blanket down. I was terrified and ran to my grandma, but she didn't seem surprised at all. She just told me to pray and go back to bed. But how could I? For months after that, I couldn't sleep without someone else in the room with me. But the story doesn't end there. The dark feeling still remains in our apartment. I often wonder if the old lady's curse is still at work, affecting not just our family, but anyone who comes close to the apartment. What if this evil energy has attached itself to me, following me wherever I go? Every strange sound, every shadow in the corner of my eye makes me question if it's something more than just my imagination. And the worst part? I'm not sure if it will ever go away. But one thing is for sure, this is a story that is far from over.
It all started on a crisp fall morning in 2005. I was just another high school student trying to survive the daily grind. My school was old, with a history that stretched back nearly a century. The building creaked and groaned, as if it had a life of its own. I never paid much attention to it until that day. I had just transferred to the school, and I was assigned locker number 237. The locker was in the farthest, darkest corner of the hallway, almost as if it was hidden away on purpose. At first, I didn't think much of it, but things quickly took a turn for the worse. On the first day, I found a note inside the locker. It was written in shaky handwriting that looked almost childlike. It simply said, "Help me." I figured it was some sort of prank and ignored it, shoving my books into the locker and slamming it shut. But the notes kept coming. Every day, there was a new one waiting for me. "I'm trapped. They won't let me out. Please, I need your help." The handwriting was always the same, desperate and uneven. One day, I decided to stay after school to see who was messing with me. I hid around the corner, watching the locker. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. But no one came. After what felt like hours, I gave up and walked over to the locker. When I opened it, my heart stopped. Inside was a small, dusty box. It hadn't been there before. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box, revealing an old, yellowed photograph of a young girl. She looked no older than 12, her eyes wide with fear. As I held the photograph, I felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath. The lights flickered, and I heard a faint whisper.
Help me.
I dropped the photograph and slammed the locker shut. I ran out of the school, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. The girl's face was etched into my mind, her eyes haunting me. The next day I tried to tell my friends, but they laughed it off. They said it was just a stupid prank, that I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to do some research. I spent hours in the library, digging through old newspapers and yearbooks. And then I found it. A story from 1952 about a girl who had gone missing. Her name was Emily Thompson, and she had been a student at my school. The last place she was seen was by her locker, number 237. My blood ran cold as I realized that Emily had been trying to reach out to me. The notes, the photograph, they were all her cries for help. But there was nothing I could do. Emily had been dead for over 50 years. I tried to avoid the locker after that, but it was impossible. I had to pass by it every day, and every time I did, I could feel her presence. The air would grow colder, and I would hear that same faint whisper.
Help me.
One day I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the locker one last time, hoping to find some sort of closure. But the locker was empty. No notes, no photograph, nothing. It was as if Emily had never existed. I switched lockers the next day, but the memory of Emily Thompson stayed with me. I could still feel her cold breath on the back of my neck, still hear her desperate whispers.
Help me.
The school eventually tore down the old building and built a new one. But I knew that Emily's spirit would never rest. Even now, all these years later, I still think about her. I wonder if she's still trapped in that old locker, waiting for someone to help her. I hope wherever she is, she finally found peace.
It all started when my roommates left for the weekend. They were going on a camping trip, and since I had work to finish, I decided to stay back. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time. Our house was old, but I liked it. Big windows, high ceilings, and wood floors that creaked when you walked on them. Sometimes the wind would make strange noises, but nothing too unusual. Friday night, I was watching TV, trying to relax after a long week. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the show playing in the background. Then around 10:45 p.m., I was thinking of going to bed. Then suddenly, I heard a loud noise echoed from upstairs. I jumped and seems like my heartbeat stopped. I paused the TV and listened. It was silent again. I convinced myself it must have been something falling over. Maybe I had left a window open and the wind knocked something down. That seemed like the most logical explanation. I grabbed my phone for some light and headed upstairs to check it out. The staircase was dark, with only a weak light coming from a single bulb above. When I reached the top, I checked all the rooms. Nothing seemed out of place. The windows were shut and nothing had fallen over. I tried to shrug it off and headed back down. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again. From the attic door at the end of the hallway. It was 3 heavy knocks coming from the door at the end of the hallway. My heart raced. The door was always shut. I never went up there. It was dusty, filled with old stuff we didn't need. The knocking felt deliberate, like someone was trying to get out. I summoned the courage to open it. I slowly walked toward the door. My hand was shivering as I reached for the knob. I twisted it slowly and pushed the door open. The attic was pitch black, and the only light was from my phone's weak flashlight. I shined the light inside. Nothing. It was just the same old dusty boxes, broken furniture, and cobwebs. I closed the door quickly and headed downstairs, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Maybe it was just my imagination. That's what I told myself. I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to the attic and those knocks. Then, just as I was beginning to calm down, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard anyone go upstairs, and I was alone in the house. The footsteps grew closer, but stopped just before reaching the bottom. I didn't want to go look, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I stood up and slowly walked toward the doorway. I leaned my head slightly around the corner, just enough to peek. Nothing. The stairs were empty. Then I decided to lock all the doors and windows, just in case someone had broken in. After double-checking everything, I sat back down, too tense to watch TV. Hours passed like this, then, at nearly 2 a.m., there was a knock at the front door. I jumped up, and my heart was pounding. I checked through the peephole, but no one was there. Trying to brush it off as a prank, I sat back down, but another knock. Louder this time. My blood ran cold. I felt watched. Again, I checked the door. No one was there. But then the knocking turned to pounding. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering that someone was trying to break into my house. The pounding stopped suddenly, but the silence felt even worse. That's when I heard it, a voice, soft and creepy, from the other side of the door. "Let me in." My blood froze. It didn't sound human. "Let me in," it repeated louder. I panicked and shouted that I was calling the police. The voice laughed. A chilling sound that echoed through the house. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. My phone was the only source of light now, and I could barely see anything around me. The voice came again, closer now. "Let me in." I turned around, shining my phone's light into the darkness, but there was nothing. The house felt colder, like something dark and evil was watching me. The footsteps continue, this time coming from upstairs, slowly descending the staircase. I was trying to move but couldn't, trapped by fear. The sound reached the bottom of the stairs, then stopped. I could feel a presence, something cold and menacing, lurking just beyond the reach of my light. I pointed the beam toward the corner of the room and saw it, a tall, shadowy figure, half hidden in the darkness. It was tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed too long for its body. It stood there, watching me. Paralyzed with fear, I couldn't move. The figure took a step forward. Its movements were slow and deliberate. Suddenly, my phone's light flickered, then went out completely, and I was plunged into darkness. A whisper came from behind me. "Let me in." I couldn't take it anymore. I ran for the front door, fumbling with the lock, shaking so badly I could barely get it open. I threw open the door, ran down the street, and didn't look back. I reached the end of the block and finally stopped. The police finally arrived, and I explained what had happened, at least the parts that made sense. I told them about the knocking, the footsteps, the voice, and the shadow. They checked the house, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, and no evidence of anyone else being there. They said it was probably my imagination, but I knew better. The next day, I packed up my things and moved out of the house. Months passed, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I still woke up and heard that soft whisper voice, "Let me in." And no matter where I am, no matter how far I run, I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. I'd always been a city girl, moving from one apartment to another as I climbed the corporate ladder. But the new place I found was different, a little too different. It was on the 13th floor of an old building. The rent was cheap, unbelievably cheap for the location. The landlord, a quiet old man with sunken eyes, seemed eager to have me sign the contract. He didn't ask many questions, and I didn't either. I just wanted a place to rest after long hours at work. When the doors opened, I stepped into a dimly lit hallway that felt eerily empty. The lights flickered as I pulled my suitcase to apartment 1306. I noticed that the door across the hall, apartment 1307, had an old-fashioned keyhole that looked out of place. It seemed like it belonged to a different time. I ignored it, unlocked my door, and walked in. The first few nights passed uneventfully, just me unpacking and settling into the space. The apartment was small but cozy, with a view of the bustling street below. I tried to feel it like a home, but then strange things started happening. It began with noises. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes groaning, but these sounds were different. Footsteps echoing in the hallway, faint whispers. They seemed to be coming from apartment 1307. I didn't think much of it until one night when I returned home late from work. The hallway was darker than usual, the flickering lights casting shadows on the walls. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard someone, murmuring behind me. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. My heart pounded as I quickly unlocked my door and stepped inside. Later that night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard it again, whispering just outside my door. I held my breath, trying to listen. It was a woman's voice, soft and trembling, saying something I couldn't quite understand. It sounded like she was pleading. I was awake now. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was tired and hearing things that weren't there. But the whispering continued, growing louder and more desperate. I threw off the blankets and got out of bed. My hands were shaking as I cautiously approached the door. When I reached it, the whispering stopped. I pressed my ear to the door, waiting, hoping I wouldn't hear anything. After a few seconds, I let out a shaky breath and stepped back. That's when the door handle rattled. I froze. My heart stopped beating. The handle jiggled again, as if someone was trying to get in. I moved backwards, my mind racing. Should I open the door? Should I call the police? But before I could decide, the rattling stopped and the hallway outside fell silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding my phone, ready to dial 911 at the first sign of anything unusual. But nothing else happened. The next morning, I was tired, unable to focus on anything after the events of the previous night. My thoughts kept drifting to apartment 1307. Was someone living there? If so, why hadn't I seen them? And why did they sound so terrified? I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I waited until late afternoon, hoping to see whoever lived there. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway. It was as empty as ever. I crossed to apartment 1307 and stopped. I knocked, my hand trembling slightly. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Taking a deep breath, I tried the handle. It turned easily and the door creaked open. I peeked inside. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn tightly shut. A foul, musty odor hit me, making me gag. It smelled like something had been rotting in there for a long time. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. "Is anyone here?" Silence. My heart pounded in my ears as I stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under my feet. I tried to find a light switch, but found none. The apartment was small, like mine, with a similar layout, but it was completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, nothing. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway. Something about it pulled me closer, even though every instinct screamed at me to leave. I walked slowly, every step feeling like a mistake. When I reached the door, I hesitated, then pushed it open. The room was dark, but I saw a shadow in the corner, a figure, hunched over, facing the wall. My breath caught in my throat. It was a woman, her hair messy and dirty, her clothes torn and stained. She was whispering something. I wanted to run, but my feet were frozen to the spot. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I whisper. She didn't respond, just kept wobbling and whispering. I took a step closer. That's when I heard it, the words she was repeating over and over. "Let me out." Then I took another step forward, and the floorboard creaked loudly. The woman stopped whispering. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were empty, hollow voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Her mouth twisted into a creepy smile. "Too late," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're too late." I stumbled back. Before I could react, she jumped at me with her thin hands. I screamed and fell over my own feet as I rushed out of the room. I shut the door quickly behind me and ran towards the exit, not daring to look back. I burst into the hallway, gasping for breath. My mind spun with fear and confusion. What had I just witnessed? Was it real? I had to escape that building now. I made it to the elevator and wildly pressed the button. The doors took forever to open, but when they finally did, I rushed inside and jabbed the ground floor button. When the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened, I ran out of the building without looking back. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street. My legs were shaking. I couldn't go back, not ever. Whatever was in that apartment, it wasn't human. And it wasn't something I wanted to understand. I stayed with a friend that night, too scared to be alone. The next day, I went back to the building to pack my things. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to leave that building. But when I arrived, the landlord was nowhere to be found. I asked the building manager about apartment 1307. He gave me a puzzled look. Apartment 1307? He repeated. Are you sure you've got the right number? We don't have a 1307 here. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to tell him in my shaking voice, I've heard things coming from that apartment. There was a woman inside. I even opened the door. The manager's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Miss, I think you might be mistaken. This building only goes up to 1306. We haven't had 1307 in over 20 years. That apartment was sealed off after. He hesitated, unsure if he should continue the story or not. After what? I asked. Then he started telling me the story. He said, there was an incident. A woman lived there a long time ago. She was disturbed and had some mental issues. She lived alone, but one day she just disappeared. They found her locked inside her apartment, dead. No one knows how she died. There was no sign of a break-in, and the door was locked from the inside. Then I asked, what happened to the apartment? The manager replied, they sealed it off. No one's lived there since. The room's been walled up just to keep people from messing around with it. But sometimes the old renters say they hear things, footsteps, voices. People say her spirit never left. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the building. I didn't know what I had experienced in that place, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back. And yet, as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, following me. I could almost hear the whispers as I got further from the building. Even now, as I lie awake at night in my new place, far from that cursed building, I still hear those whispers, let me out. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see her face, the scary smile, the hollow eyes, and I know deep down that it's not over. Not yet. Remember that night clearly, one of those rainy evenings when the clouds seemed to be raining non-stop. The sky was barely visible through the thick sheets of rain. I was working a late shift as an Uber driver, trying to earn some extra money before the weekend. The streets were almost empty, and the few cars that passed by splashed a lot of water. My windshield wipers were moving fast, trying to clear the raindrops, and my headlights were struggling to shine through the fog. I was driving along an unusually quiet street when my phone buzzed. I got a new ride request. The pickup location was in a neighborhood I didn't know well, so I had to navigate through dark, dimly lit roads to get there. When I arrived at my location, I noticed the street was eerily quiet. The rain was pounding on my car's roof, making a steady beat that felt weird and scary. There, I saw my rider coming towards me. They came out of the darkness, holding a big umbrella that wasn't doing much to keep them dry. They were wearing dark clothes and a hat that hid their face. I couldn't see any of their faces clearly. "Hello?" I called out with a forced smile. The rider nodded and slowly got into the back seat of my car. They didn't say a word, which made me feel a bit uneasy. The only sounds were the rain pounding against the roof and the occasional loud sound of thunder. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I caught a quick glimpse of their pale face before they turned away, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The GPS took me on a never-ending, curvy road. The rain turned the streets into flowing rivers, and flashes of lightning lit up the dark landscape in scary bursts. The windshield wipers worked hard to clear the water, but the glass fogged up with every breath I took. I tried to talk to my passengers, but they didn't respond, making the atmosphere in the car feel chillier and serious. Their silence was unsettling, and I couldn't help but wonder who this mysterious person was and where we were headed on this stormy night. "Where to?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Finally, my passenger spoke up in a whisper voice. "Just keep driving." I kept driving, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of concern that grew stronger with every mile. The road got smaller and smaller, with thick, crooked trees that seemed to lean closer to the car, as if trying to listen in on our conversation. The storm just got worse and worse, with no end in sight. The rain came down harder and harder, pounding against the windows like a never-ending drumbeat. It was like the storm was trying to trap us. I gripped the wheel tightly, my heart racing with every snap of thunder and flash of lightning. Suddenly, the car's headlights began to flicker and then went out entirely. The only light came from the occasional lightning bolt, casting ghostly shadows on the road. I tried restarting the engine, but it was no use. I was trapped, surrounded by the storm and the oppressive silence of my mysterious passenger. "Do you have a flashlight?" I asked in my shaky voice. The passenger remained eerily quiet. I could sense their eyes staring at me, but I dared not turn around. Instead, I searched the glove compartment for anything that might help. As I dug through it, the rain grew louder and the temperature inside the car dropped. Just then, a flash of lightning illuminated the interior of my car, and for a split second, I saw the passenger's face clearly. His eyes were hollow, with a chilling expression that showed no emotions at all. I was paralyzed with fear, my blood ran cold. "What do you want?" I asked in my shaky voice. "We're almost there." "Just keep driving," the passenger replied. The storm seemed to get worse and worse, the wind howling around us. The trees outside were like dancers in a crazy storm, and the car was hit with flying debris. The wipers were ineffective, and I could barely see anything. Then the storm ended up. The heavy rain turned into a light drizzle, and the strong wind became calm. I can now see the road clearly again, and the headlights flickered back to life. I sighed in relief, but then I heard a scary laugh coming from the back seat. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty. I hit the brakes hard and turned around, but the back seat was empty. I only saw the passenger's umbrella on the wet seat. My heart was racing like crazy as I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a new message. I looked at it, and my blood ran cold. It was a text from an unknown number, with a single line, "Thanks for the ride." The GPS pinged, indicating that I had reached my destination. I looked around, but there was nothing but darkness. The whole area seemed abandoned. The once familiar surroundings were now unfamiliar and menacing. I quickly got out of the car and tried to call the Uber support line, but there was no signal. I was completely alone. As I walked back to the car, a new message popped up on my phone. It was a video of me from inside the car, taken during the ride. In the background, I could see the passenger's ghostly face, staring directly into the camera with a chilling, empty smile. The final frame showed the text, "You're not alone." I froze. My mind stopped working. As I drove away, the rain started again, just as heavy as before. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that haunting figure again. Every drive after that felt different, with every shadow and every sound making me jump. I could never shake the feeling that something was always just behind me, waiting. The rain never seemed to wash away the fear, and the storm that night had left more than just a chill in the air. And every time I hear the rain, I can't help but wonder if it's calling me back to that dark, twisted road. Because sometimes, I feel like that passenger never truly left. I was working the night shift at the hospital, a job I had been doing for years but still couldn't get used to. The rain was relentless that night, hammering against the windows like it wanted to get inside. The sound was noisy, echoing through the empty hallways and making everything feel colder and lonelier. I wrapped my sweater tightly around me. It wasn't just the weather. There was something in the air, something that made me feel like I shouldn't be here. It was 2:30 a.m., and the emergency room was strangely quiet. A few patients were resting in the waiting area, and the occasional cough echoed down the hallway. I was in the nurses' station, trying to keep busy, but the flickering lights were giving me a headache. I looked at the clock, but the flow of time seemed to be moving at a snail's pace. Suddenly, the lights flickered again and went out, but didn't come back on right away. I stared at the dim emergency lights that were switched on, casting weird shadows on the walls. The sound of the rain increased, and for a moment I felt completely alone. I could see the buzzing of the lights struggling to stay on, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something felt wrong in the hospital, like the building itself was alive and watching me. I decided to take a walk around, to keep myself awake and shake off the fear growing inside me. As I walked down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoed back at me, and each step felt heavier than the last. I passed by empty patient rooms, their doors slightly open, with shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a strange flicker of light coming from room 304, a room that should have been empty. I stopped, trying to remember if I had left any lights on in there, but I was sure I hadn't. My heart started beating faster, and I felt a strong urge to go back, but I kept moving forward. I told myself it was just a faulty light, trying to calm my nerves. I slowly pushed the door open, and the sight inside made me freeze. The room was dark except for the faint glow of a small lamp. The bed, which had been empty earlier, now had a patient in it, a woman, her face pale and eyes closed. I blinked, trying to recall if I had missed something, but I was sure no new patients had been admitted. The woman's appearance was strange. She was wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown, the kind we hadn't used in decades, and her long, wet hair was spread across the pillow, like she had just been brought in from the rain. I moved closer, and the air felt colder. The woman wasn't breathing, and her face looked like she was in pain. At first, I wanted to check her pulse, but something held me back. There was a bad smell, like mold and something rotten. I leaned in closer, trying to ignore the scary feeling that was growing inside me. That's when her eyes snapped open. They were wide and vacant, staring right through me, and her lips began to move without making a sound. I stumbled back, nearly stumbling over my own feet, as the light in the room began to flicker. She started to whisper, her voice barely audible over the rain, but I heard a few words. "He's coming. Don't let him in." Before I could react, the lights in the room went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the door. The whispers turned into a low hum, like a chant, and I could feel the vibrations in my bones. I finally managed to grab the door handle and pulled it open, started running back into the hallway. The rain was louder now, almost deafening, and I could hear faint footsteps approaching. But when I looked, no one was there. I ran back to the nurses' station. My colleague, Lisa, was there, looking at me with confusion. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to catch my breath, pointing back down the hallway. "There's a woman in room 304. She's not supposed to be there." Lisa stared back at me and took a flashlight. We both went back to the room. I was trying to figure out what I saw, but when we got there, the room was empty. There was no one in the bed, no lamp, nothing. The bed was neat and tidy, and there were no signs of anyone ever being there. Lisa looked at me concerned. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded and said, "She was there, Lisa. She said something about not letting someone in." Lisa's face went pale. "You've heard the stories, don't you, about the man in the rain?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she was looking nervous. I had heard the staff talking about it, but I never believed it. It was just a scary story, right? They said that during heavy rain, a man in a wet black coat would appear, searching for lost souls to take with him. Patients and staff had reported seeing him over the years, always during the rain, always when the lights flickered. Just then, we heard footsteps coming from the hallway. They were slow and heavy. We turned to look, and that's when we saw him. A tall, dark figure stood at the end of the hall, just out of reach of the dim emergency lights. His face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, and his coat was dripping wet, with water pooling on the floor around him. Lisa grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "Don't look at him," she whispered in her shaky voice. "He's not real. Just don't look." But it was too late. He slowly turned his head towards us. Even though I couldn't see his eyes, I knew he was looking straight at me. The hallway seemed to shrink, making him feel closer than he really was. The figure moved closer, and I heard a squelching sound as his wet boots touched the floor. Lisa pulled me back, breaking my focus, and we started running. We didn't stop until we reached the elevator. We kept pressing the button until the doors opened. As we got in, I saw the figure standing in the hallway, water falling from his coat, not moving at all, before the doors closed. The elevator ride felt like forever. When we reached the lobby, the sound of the rain was quieter, but the weird feeling didn't leave. The next morning, as the sun finally rose through the stormy clouds, we checked the records. There was no one admitted to room 304 that night, and the security cameras showed nothing. No woman, no figure in the rain, nothing. Since then, I haven't worked a night shift, and every time it rains, I feel a creepy vibe. I can't imagine what the woman whispered. "He's coming. Don't let him in." And now every time I hear the rain, I wonder if he's out there, waiting for someone else to see him, waiting to be let in. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these true, terrifying stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss scary stories that will keep you up at night.